Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you again today to do another Praying the Scripture devotional. Today I'm going to be continuing on false prophets and teachers and the teaching on how to know when you might be in the front of or in the presence of a false teacher or false prophet. So in Proverbs 29, verse 25, in the Amplified Version, it says, "The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in and puts his confidence in the Lord will be exalted and safe." So, Proverbs 29, verse 25, discusses one of the things that can cause a person to begin to walk in falsehood or to begin to become a false prophet or a false teacher. Because if we fear man, we will water down the gospel, and we will water down and we will change the prophetic word that we have received from the Lord. And in doing that, we become just another voice. We lose our alarm ability. We lose the voice of being an alarm. And so prophets and teachers from God are called to be alarms, and they are called to sound forth the message that is on God's heart. As believers, and especially as teachers and prophets, we have a responsibility to bring the truth to light. Not a watered down version that doesn't bring change or doesn't warn others. And if we struggle with being afraid of other people's reactions, their responses, and their words, we will not stand with a staff of authority in our hand. We're going to stand with a snake in our hand instead. Let me explain that a little bit more by taking you back to Moses. You see, Moses had been afraid of the people of Egypt because after he had killed a man, an Egyptian actually, and had hidden him in the sand, the royalty of the land decided and determined that they were going to kill him. And so he didn't know whom to trust anymore. He knew he couldn't trust royalty, but he also knew he didn't know who he could trust who was Egyptian. And then because of the responses of the Hebrew people that were there when he killed the Egyptian, he didn't know if he could trust them either. So at this point in time, everybody had become suspect in Moses' mind. And so he fled because he was afraid of men. And so here we are, years later, and we find Moses on the brink of beginning to walk into the fullness of his destiny. But he didn't know that. He's just standing in front of a burning bush. He has no idea that his whole life is about to change, that his call is about to change. But he's on the brink of his destiny. And the thing is, in order to walk into the fullness of that destiny, he needed to overcome the fear of man by walking in the fear of the Lord. And so this is why I believe the Lord had caused all of this to happen, is so that Moses would realize the greatness of God and the littlest of man. And in order for Moses to overcome the fear of man, he had to throw down the staff that he had in his hand. This staff that he had been given and the staff that he had received from a very powerful man. Let's not forget that his father-in-law, Jethro, gave him this staff. And just the fact that it's his father-in-law makes him powerful. But he was also the priest of Midian. So here this man comes and he has authority in order to give Moses this staff and the rod to be able to take care of the sheep that belonged to this man. But Moses needed to throw down that authority given by this man, given by man. And let's consider that for a moment, because he'd been given authority by Pharaoh himself. And then because he killed a man, he had to flee, and now he's out in the middle of nowhere, and he'd been given authority by yet another powerful man. But the authority he'd had previously was great. This authority seemed to be less than. He was dealing with stinky sheep, and now here he is about to receive the greatest authority of all, authority given by God. And so what we see here with Moses is he needed to throw down the authority that he had been given by men so that he could take up the authority as a prophet and a teacher that God was calling him to. So he had to lay down the authority of a shepherd to take up the authority of a teacher and a prophet. And I think probably the hardest thing for many of us in this is that it's the laying down of what we're familiar with. Moses had done this job for 40 years now. So he was very familiar with the staff that he held. He was very familiar with the authority that he held. And he might have even probably thought that it was his calling. And in order to pick up, excuse me, the true call and the authority of God, he needed to lay this down. See, Moses had learned a lot on the backside of the desert, watching someone else's sheep. And isn't that the way that we sometimes feel? And, even when we do the things that God has called us to do, we're still watching over his sheep. Moses, up until this time, had been obedient to everything his father-in-law had commanded him to do. But when I look at the Moses, because what we usually do is we look at the Moses in Egypt, and the Moses in the wilderness, starting at the burning bush. But we forget about this Moses that lived for 40 years in the middle of the desert. And when I look at this Moses that's sandwiched in between these two powerhouses, I think that, I look at Moses and I wonder if he didn't lose some of his personal convictions during this time, because it looks like he's lost some of his zeal and determination as he suffered in the heat of the day and the cold of the night as he pondered his previous mistakes in Egypt. It looks like some of that zealousness had waned. And the other thing is Moses probably looked at his age and decided he was almost ready to die anyway. So what difference did it make? And he probably thought about what he had believed was the word that God had spoken to him about being a deliverer of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people. And, he probably looked at that and he tried to recover it, but it seemed to be laying in inches of dust in the recesses of his mind. And he thought, well, that was just a pipe dream and maybe I misunderstood and I didn't hear what God was saying completely. So he laid that to rest as well. But you see, what he needed to do before he could pick all of that up is he had to throw down to the ground the authority of men at the feet of the Lord. He needed to lay it all down, and he was able to do that. Because you see, Moses needed to obey a different voice than the one he had been accustomed to hearing. A different voice, a voice with the most authority. He needed to obey that voice, not hear the voice of Pharaoh, not hear the voice of Jethro. He needed to hear the voice of God. And throwing down his staff in the dust and the dirt symbolizes that he understood that man given authority belongs to the things of the earth, and they were unclean and they were not powerful in the authority of God. But you see, God, he didn't come up with this idea. It was the Lord's command that required him to throw it down. See, God was waiting for a response. God was waiting for Moses to do something with the word that he had been told. But as soon as that staff hit the dirt, it became a snake. And that is the thing about men's authority. We need to understand this as well. If it's given by man, the authority that we're given by man has to be upheld by man. And it has to continually be authenticated by men and by the audience that accepts it. And those people have to be willing to continue to applaud it and lavish attention to it continually in order for it to continue. Because when it stops, and it often does stop for various reasons, the very people who held you in place, the very people who put you in place will bite you, and they will tear at you, and they will try to destroy you and discredit you. Because you see, man's authority only lasts for a season, but God's authority cannot be removed. And then at the very command of the Lord, Moses needed to pick that snake up by the tail, which is a very dangerous thing to do because a snake bite in the middle of the desert can kill you and there's nobody else around. So you're going to die if that snake bites you. And this is where we learn that whatever the Lord asks us to do, even the most dangerous of tasks, it requires that we trust him to see us through to the other side, regardless of what things might happen in the midst of our obedience or after our obedience. Moses knew enough about snakes that he knew if it bit him, he would die. But he also understood from his recent moment at the burning bush in front of him that either way, if he lived or if he died, he needed to obey the voice of God. And he must have been more terrified to do this one thing than all the things he had been told to do by any man, Pharaoh included. And little did he know, little did he realize how valuable this lesson was going to be very soon. But he was just being obedient. This is a moment of testing. And so he did exactly as he was instructed, because something about that voice that spoke from that fire that would not be consumed and would not consume the bush convinced him it was going to be okay. And as he bent down, I'm thinking probably in greater fear than he had ever experienced before in his life, he grabbed the tail of that snake, and as he did, that snake turned into God-given, God-proven authority in his hand. It turned back into a staff. And that rod of authority became a visible and tangible, continual reminder of the fear of God that he learned that day. He would never be able to do anything without going, I've seen this rod become a snake, become a rod. And in picking it up, I received the authority of God. And he carried this rod with him, this staff with him, until the very end of his life. You see, we cannot just stop worrying about what other people say or do because we don't want to have the fear of man to rule our speech or our movements. We can't convince ourselves to stop worrying about it. We have to have more of the fear of the Lord than we do the fear of man. So what's the remedy? What's the solution here? I believe we need to work on cultivating a deep and reverent fear/honor of God, so that we will always be obedient in everything he asks, even when it means speaking a word or teaching or prophecy that might not be widely accepted or applauded, or maybe especially if. And this means what we need to do is we need to study the full character of God and accept all that he is, and to accept that he is all of those things he says in the word, not just the parts we like. Because, to understand that, yes, he is our Father, but he is also our judge. He is love, absolutely, but he also hates some things, and we would do well if we stayed away from those things that he says that he hates. We have to understand the full character of God. False teachers and false prophets walk in a fear of man more than they do the fear of God, because they want to be liked and they want to avoid persecution. False prophets and teachers will lean upon those who back them, who support them, and financially fund them to keep them in the spotlight. And they will want to make those people happy more than they want to make God happy. And in order to keep these people happy, they must give them what they want, not what they need. And so if the message that you're hearing from somebody is unclear, or if its points that's being talked about seem muted, or if they're compromised in any way, shape, or form, you might be listening to a message that has become false. So I would suggest you take it to the Lord and ask for discernment to know what to do with that. The message of Jesus Christ is the message of the gospel, and that has to continue to be the message. If Jesus Christ is not the center point, then you might not have the truth of the gospel. He is God. I am not. He is authority. He gives me authority. And these things cannot be taken in reverse. They cannot. The fear of man will always bring a snare to anyone, but most especially to the child of God. We cannot keep the shifting tides of human beings happy forever, because they don't stay in one place long. A nice teaching comes along and they'll grab a hold of it and they'll run with it. We can't keep people happy forever. We will fail them. But if we want to be protected, let's put our trust and let's put our confidence in the Lord. He alone will keep us safe. And in due time, God will exalt us. Let's look at our prayer points. Number 1, Do you struggle with the fear of man? If yes, ask the Lord to bring healing to you so you can walk courageously before Him. Number 2, have you ever studied the character of God or the names of God? I encourage you to do so, and as you do, ask the Lord to help you to accept His full character. Number 3, are you willing to lay down your rod of authority given by man to pick up the authority of God? It can sound really good to say, but it can be much more difficult to do. And are you willing to pick that same authority up by the tail so that you can put an end to it, knowing that you might be bitten by it? Number 4, do your favorite preachers and teachers and prophets keep the message of Jesus Christ as the centerpiece of the gospel? Number 5, do you struggle with being completely honest before the Lord? Pray and ask the Lord to help you to become completely transparent and honest before Him all the time in all things. So that's another point on the false prophets. It might be that if they're afraid of man, they're going to give men what they want to hear, not what we need to hear. So thank you so much for tuning in today.